voltage gated sodium channels, specifically their role in the action potential. Okay, so a couple of things we want to make a note of before we actually look at the channels. One is that these channels are voltage sensitive. All right. In other words, they're going to open at negative 55 millivolts. And then they're going to subsequently close when we get to positive 30 millivolts. Okay. The other thing we want to say is that there are two gates on the channel. Right, so two gating mechanisms happening on the channel. Those include the activation gate, which is voltage dependent only. Okay, and then there's also the inactivation gate, which is both voltage and time dependent. Okay, so let's look at three scenarios. One is at rest. We know rest to be negative 70 millivolts in terms of the membrane potential. Okay, let's look at depolarize, which is the initial phase of the action potential. We know that that happens or starts at least at negative 55. Right, that's the threshold value to start depolarization. And then we're going to think about repolarization, which is the second phase of the action potential. The trigger for repolarization is when we get to the peak of our action potential, which is positive 30 millivolts. Okay, that's when this channel essentially closes. So let's look at our first scenario here. So we're at rest, we're at a negative 70 millivolts. Let's look at what our two gates look like. So this is our channel. Hang on 1 minute. Okay, looks like it's back. Okay, so let's look at the channel itself and both of the gates. So here's our channel, right? We said it has two gates on it. So let's draw the activation gate first. In this instance, it's closed. So let's draw that. And then let's add in our inactivation gate, which is open in this instance. So here's what our inactivation gate looks like. As you can see, it's open. All right. So in this state, we can describe the channel as being closed okay? And just to describe what that means, the activation gate is closed, but the inactivation gate is open. So the channel is closed, but it is capable of being opened. Channel is closed, but capable of being opened. Right? In other words, if a strong enough graded potential or summation of graded potentials came along, then we could fire an action potential if the channel is in this state, closed but capable of being open. And what that means is that the inactivation gate is closed, or excuse me, the activation gate is closed, but the inactivation gate is open. Okay, so this is what happens at rest. So we have enough of a change to get to -55, and let's see what happens at that point. Now we open up the sodium channel. All right, so at -55, our channel is going to be open. So let's draw what that looks like in terms of both the gates. So that means the activation gate is now open. And the inactivation gate also open. All right. And excuse my crappy drawings here. So the inactivation gate is open. So let's describe the state of the channel here as well. So the channel is now open. In other words, activation gate is open and inactivation gate also open. Okay, hopefully this makes sense so far. Again, please let me know if you have questions, but hopefully everyone is still with me. So now we have depolarized the cell. We get to -55. This channel is now fully open. Both gates are open. And so sodium starts rushing in the cell. One important thing to say is that because the inactivation gate is voltage and time dependent, there is a 1 millisecond timer that goes off when the inactivation gate gets to -55. Right? So after 1 millisecond of being open, automatically a timer begins to measure the time. And after 1 millisecond of the channel being fully open, the inactivation gate itself will close. So it's really important to remember this time-dependent component of the inactivation gate, especially as it applies to the depolarizing phase. 1 millisecond after this event begins, automatically that inactivation gate closes, and we're going to end up seeing that remains closed for repolarization as well. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. So our channel again at +30 is going to be the trigger to close this channel. So let's see what that looks like. That means that the activation gate is still open, right? It doesn't close right away. But the inactivation gate has now closed because of this 1 millisecond timed event here. Our inactivation gate is now fully closed. Oops, okay. So now the channel is closed, right? But it's not the same closed as it was at rest. Let's describe this. We can say that the channel is closed, but, or not but, sorry, and the channel is closed and incapable of being opened. Okay, simply because the inactivation gate is closed. What that means is that even though a strong enough stimulus came by that was at -55, there is no way to open up this channel. So the channel is not capable of being opened here, even if we had a -55 threshold change or a graded potential that's strong enough to become an action potential. The channel is said to be in its absolute refractory period, okay, which means that the activation gate is open and the inactivation gate is closed. Okay. Okay, excellent question here. When does repolarization go back to a resting state then? So what has to happen for repolarization to go back to a resting state is all of the potassium has to leave the cell. We're going to go on to look at in more detail as to why this mechanism exists. But what this means is that we cannot have action potentials rolling into one another. One action potential must start, depolarization must start, by depolarization, yes. Then repolarization occurs, and the cell is actually going to go way down past rest. Okay, it's going to way down past rest, almost approaching potassium's equilibrium potential. And then after all that potassium has left the cell by the actions of the sodium potassium pump, that's going to reset the cell to a resting memory potential, and then we can fire another action potential. So this prevents action potentials from rolling into one another. We have to fire one. It has to come to a complete end. The cell has to get back to rest first before the cell can be, before the channel, excuse me, can be open or capable of being opened even though it's closed. Okay, so for us to get back to this state, we're going to have to repolarize the cell beyond the resting memory potential. It's going to go more negative, and then it's going to come back up to rest, and then the activation gate will be closed over here, and the inactivation gate will be open. Okay, this is a phenomenon called the absolute refractory period. We're going to speak more about this, but I'm going to make a note of it here. This mechanism is responsible for the absolute refractory period. Okay, in other words, there is a period of time at the end of one action potential where the cell has to get back to its resting value comfortably first before another action potential can be stimulated or can be fired. Okay. All right. Any other questions on what we've said here? I'm going to pause for a few seconds just so you can finish up drawing. Okay, but please let me know if you have questions. Okay, let's keep going here. All right. Let's look at potassium's gating mechanism. So we also have voltage gated potassium channels. They are at around positive 30 millivolts. That is when they are activated. And that is going to open up the potassium channel. Potassium is going to rush out of the cell according to its ECDF. Right, remember, potassium wants to get out of the cell, sodium wants to get in. So if we open up potassium channels, potassium will try to leave the cell. This is what helps to repolarize the cell back to a negative value. As all of that positive tries to leave the cell, we can get back down to our negative 70 millivolts. As we described previously, that doesn't happen right away. We actually overshoot the membrane potential, right? Because we're trying to approach potassium's equilibrium potential, which is actually more negative than the resting membrane potential. It's negative 94. So whenever these potassium channels are now open, potassium is leaving the cell in an effort to get to its equilibrium potential, which is past the resting membrane potential. And then finally, those potassium channels will close, and then it will readjust back to rest. Okay, so we have the channel closed all throughout the initial part of the action potential, throughout the depolarization phase. The channel will be activated in terms of being open as soon as we get to the end of the depolarizing phase. As soon as we get to positive 30, the channel now opens up. Potassium can leave the cell, and then there will be a refractory period where the channel is inactivated, right? It's not possible to open the channel because we have not gotten back to negative 70, or we have not gotten back to rest. Okay, now potassium is a little bit easier than sodium because the gating mechanisms are pretty much working in the same way. And so the main point to remember about potassium is that it's open at positive 30, and potassium is leaving the cell, and then it's going to become inactivated during that refractory period until we actually get back to negative 70. All right. There is only one gate on the potassium channels. Again, it's a little bit more straightforward than the sodium channels. It is both voltage and time dependent, and it is a negative feedback example. Why is it a negative feedback example? Because instead of getting us away from our set point, which is what the sodium channels do, it's bringing us back to our set point, which is what we see here. So when potassium channels are open, potassium can leave the cell, leaving behind more negative, which is what our resting membrane potential looks like. In other words, our set point being negative 70. And so the movement of potassium through its channels actually gets us back to our set point, or that negative 70 millivolts. Okay. So let's describe that here again. So an action potential, we said, is a large, rapid depolarization that is used as a form of communication. What is happening during an action potential? The first part of that is the depolarizing event, or the depolarization. We get to our negative 55 threshold value. We open up these sodium channels. Sodium rushes into the cell. The membrane potential increases gradually. It's becoming more positive. When we get to positive 30, there is an inactivation of our sodium channels, right, which sets off that 1 millisecond timer, but also automatically there's an opening up of the potassium channels. So two things happen at this point at positive 30. Sodium stops moving, potassium starts moving. What do we think is going to happen? The membrane potential is going to start moving in the opposite direction, right? We close our sodium channels, open up or activate our potassium channels, and now potassium starts moving in the opposite direction. It's really important to remember that these have opposite electrochemical driving forces. Sodium wants to get in, potassium wants to get out. So at this point, when we reverse the state of these channels, potassium can begin leaving the cell. That allows us to repolarize the cell. We get back down to the resting membrane potential. There's actually a point of hyperpolarization. So this is what I was describing earlier. We don't actually go back directly to rest. We go lower than the resting membrane potential. This is an event called hyperpolarization. And then we eventually become, get more negative and get more positive and settle at rest, which is negative 70. Okay, now action potentials can travel along the axon. They start at the axon hillock with signals coming in from the cell body, and they travel all the way down the entire length of the axon to the axon terminal. And then that signal can be transmitted to the adjacent neuron. okay? So at -55, we open up these voltage gated sodium channels, sodium rushes into the cell. That is what we're seeing here. This upstreak or upstroke in the membrane potential is created because of sodium's movement. All right, this is the depolarizing phase of the action potential. The cell becomes more positive. At +30, we have a swap in those gating mechanisms. The sodium channels are inactivated. The potassium channels are now open. And we have the movement of potassium, which brings us back down closer to rest. Okay, now if we think about the sodium movement alone, this is a positive feedback example. Okay, simply because we move away from our set point, we move away from that resting membrane potential all the way till we get to +30. And so in the example from homeostasis that we looked at earlier in the semester, because we're moving away from that -70, which is really our set point, or the state that we're trying to maintain, this can be an example of a positive feedback loop. All right. Now, at +30, we have a swap in the state of those channels. The sodium channels become inactivated. That is, the activation gates are open, but the inactivation gate is now closed, right? So even if we had a strong enough stimulus, we could not fire another action potential in this phase. This will be considered a negative feedback loop because if you think about what's happening on the potassium channels are now wide open, potassium is leaving the cell, and we're getting back to our resting value, which is considered a negative feedback event that gets us back to set point. Okay. As we get back down to our resting membrane value, there is now an inactivation gate of the inactivation of the potassium channels. Okay, and what that means is that potassium is no longer able to move. So the membrane potential gets more negative. We overshoot, right? If you look at this graph up here, we don't go just to -70. We actually go a little bit lower, to about -80 or so. Then the potassium channels are inactivated, and then we stop the movement of potassium. And then the other channels, the leak channels on the membrane, the sodium-potassium pump, those channels and pumps can start bringing us back gradually to our resting value.